Um, Hello, students. Good afternoon. It's afternoon right here in Elizabeth. But I decided to record this lecture even before Monday. So, because the topic is so fascinating, the Civil War, that I keep adding and adding stuff, and I'm afraid that by Monday it'll be unmanageable. So it will be too much for you and me and everybody. And therefore, let's finish this. This is going to be the last lecture. And from now on, we'll be doing the quizzes, do some IDs next week, and wrapping up things and getting ready for our final exam, which everything needs to be done by May 11th, May 12th. So that's our final deadline, which is going to be unmovable. But let's continue with the Civil War. Last time around, we started the Civil War over for Sumter, and I mentioned that this was not really it was one of the incidents that happened, but it was a part of the overall strategy of General Scott, the so-called Scott's Anaconda, a great snake that was about to blockade the South, and squeeze the South economically, making it impossible for them to export cotton, primarily to Britain. Also, cotton couldn't come to places like New York and Boston either, which was very important. Therefore, actually, Confederacy had some supporters here in New York and in Boston and in Philadelphia, the great cities of the North. We talked about the attempted assassination in Baltimore, and that happened very often. Maryland and Delaware were a real problem for Lincoln. They were slave states. They were across the Mason-Dixon line, and Mason-Dixon line is basically the southern border of Pennsylvania. They had a lot of sympathies for the Confederacy. They had a lot of sympathies for slave system, and they sabotaged transports during the Civil War. It was rough living during the Civil War in Washington D.C. because Washington D.C. is this federal district surrounded by supporters of slavery, like in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. So, anyways, the big question that is often asked, and the big questions are usually meaningless, and this is also one of those. So, but it's often asked, so I need to mention, I'm looking at the slide number 22, and the big question is, what was the war about? So I have a list over there of various suggestions. Was it about industry versus farming, industrial north versus farming south? That's where I was going, more or less, so to speak, up to this point. Then was it about state rights? That was a favorite argument of the Confederate supporters of the Confederacy, the Democrats in the South, who, well, says Jefferson, they supported state rights, not this crazy federalist party that advocated a strong central power and so on and so forth. So anyways, was the war about slavery? Yes, it was. But a lot of people say that it wasn't and it shouldn't be and so on and so forth. So anyways, I'm just listing here the various reasons. Was it about expansionism? That, well, the South was expanding into the western territories across the Mississippi, breaking the so-called Missouri Compromise, getting more and more states, slave states, into the Union, and eventually that would rig the system, right? As somebody famous said, it's not how people vote, but it's who count the votes that it matters. So the Democrats were through this system of expansion of slavery in the West were rigging the political system, which made it impossible for anybody else to get elected. A lot of people said it was Abraham Lincoln's elections. I don't think there is a president in U.S. history who was more abused than Abraham Lincoln in the press. Anyways, for his looks, for his skin complexion, for his height, and anyways, people often compare him to a monkey. Anyways, be that as it may. So was the war actually about the rebellion and secession that the Confederacy in the South, the Democrats in the South, were not willing to recognize the federal government, the legitimately elected president? Was it about, I mentioned this before, kind of hinted at this explanation, was it about the English people of English origin in the north and the Scotch-Irish in the south of the country? And these questions are meaningless because, well, obviously civil war was about all of these things, because a lot of people expressed their opinion and said, when they asked, what is the war about? Some said, it was slavery, and somebody was state rights, and somebody was that Abraham Lincoln. And so anyways, those were the things that people were saying, right? I think the job of historians is not always believe what people are saying. So I gave you my explanation for it, and I'll stick to it, and I'll repeat it here one more time. It's about two different visions for our country. The one was the vision of Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democracy, which included slavery, expansionism, and so on and so forth, and which eventually led those people into rebellion against the federal government and legitimately elected president. And the other vision was the industrial vision of the northern people, what Abraham Lincoln called the system of free labor. Anyways, so it's a never-ending game to start this debate and claim this and that, but in the end, those debates reveal something, but kind of hide even more. So, anyways, let's get on with the war. Looking at the slides 23, out of total of 34 U.S. states, first 7 southern slave-holding states, all controlled by the Democrats, were declared secession. Pardon me, just to correct this. So declared secession from the country, and created Confederate States of America. They elected their president, the Democrat Jefferson A. Davis. They had their own legislature, the Congress, which met in Montgomery, Alabama, and then moved to Virginia when Virginia joined the rebellion. And they assumed that it was their right under the Constitution that, we kind of original 13 states created a union, and they could also dissolve it. South Carolina was one of the original 13 colonies. Confederacy grew to control at least the majority of territory in 11 states altogether. It claimed the additional states of Kentucky and Missouri, and that's why there are 13 stars on the Confederate flag, because they felt that Kentucky and Missouri belonged to the Confederacy, and Kentucky and Missouri were given full representation in the Confederate Congress throughout the Civil War. The 2 remaining slave states, Delaware and Maryland, were forcefully kept within the Union. As I mentioned before, those issues with the position of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. So they were subdued by the federal troops. They were not allowed to join the Confederacy, but they wanted to. they wanted to. So, anyways, that's why the position of the Washington D.C. city of Washington was so dire throughout the war. Well, the war started relatively quickly, uh, and it was hoped that it would be a short one. To use the phrase, we'll be home by Christmas. That's what they hoped. And much like in World War One, it turned out to be a long war. It started with the attack of the well, other than the Fort Sumter episode, but Union troops moved into Virginia with the idea to get to Richmond and finish the job quickly. But looking here at the slide 24, the first Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, the Union troops were slaughtered, defeated, and it was the first indication that this thing is gonna be a big trouble. The Richmond Confederate capital was only 109 miles south of Washington, D.C. And anyways, you have a couple of details about the Battle of Manassas here, but it's important for you guys to get a big picture and not particular details about this and that battle. There are people who make this a hobby and make this more than a hobby. We're just doing the reenactments of Civil War and studying these things up to the most minuscule detail. And anyways, I'm not sure how they probably won't be happy with my kind of mushing it all together and giving you the big picture, but the big picture is a shorter picture, and we need to finish the semester. So basically we have two great theaters of war. One turned out to be totally useless, so to speak, the Eastern Theater, even though that's where the most fighting happened. The Eastern Theater is actually this stretch of land between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. And that's where all the battles happened in the Eastern Theater, including, the bloodiest of all, Gettysburg and Antietam, but there was no real progress there. Several times Union armies started penetrating and getting close to Richmond, and the Southern armies, Confederate armies, were on the way to get to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They crossed the Mason-Dixon line, got into Pennsylvania, but overall there was very little movement there, except in 1865 when finally Union troops got to Richmond, and General Lee, commander of the Army of North Virginia, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. Anyways, so this is the Eastern Theater of War. We have a picture here of Lincoln, President Lincoln, and Antietam in a very, very important battle. Namely, what happened there is there were these several disasters in the beginning for the Union, which, like this Battle of Bull Run, and Lincoln kind of kept changing the commanders. He then appointed George McClellan, a Democrat, to command the Army of the Potomac, which was the main army of the Union. And George McClellan was appointed because he had a plan to capture Richmond, and he would go east of the capital, cross the river through the Potomac, cross the York River, and get to Richmond from the east side. It was a cunning plan, as they say, but it took McClellan so long to prepare. You'll see later on, he was hated by his troops but he was such a procrastinator. He wanted to prepare for every eventuality, and in the meantime, the army of Robert E. Lee and the Southern Army in Virginia was just ready for him. Were managed to get the reinforcements and then stop him. So basically, McClellan was coming from the east and trying to surprise Virginians, but he was so slow that he didn't surprise them at all. And to counter this move, clockwise move from Washington down to Richmond, Lincoln actually attacked the North through the what is it called, the Shenandoah Valley that gets really into Pennsylvania, into Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And there was this place of Antietam where the Union troops tried to stop him. So anyways, what happens was that while McClellan was trying to attack Richmond, Lee was trying to attack Washington and capture it. So in 1862, Lee was defeated at Antietam, and it was the bloodiest battle up to that point in the war. And Lincoln was quite happy about it because he had actually something to brag with, to put into his list of accomplishments for the presidency, because the midterm elections were coming, and those midterm elections didn't go well for the Republicans or for Lincoln. They lost their majority in the House, even though they remained the largest party, but they didn't have the majority in the House, so they had to cooperate with what was left. So there were pro-union Democrats in the North, and a lot of these pro-union Democrats were not exactly pro-union. Well, they were pro-union, depending on how far you push it. They mostly meant that civil war should end quickly and forget about these issues of slavery, and they're just too crazy. Too much changes in a short time. So anyways, one of these Democrats was George McClellan. Nixon sort of upped the ante, double down, as we call it today, well, using the poker expression, right? By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation before the elections of 1862. It probably actually saved the Republicans for a larger whipping, because the Northern Republicans were to a person practically against slavery, and that was a big issue, and then motivated them, and they went to the polls and then voted. So anyways, Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1862. It was proclaimed. It wasn't really freedom for slaves everywhere. It was actually, proclamation was directed to all the areas in rebellion and all segments of the executive branch, including Army and Navy of the United States. So that is that basically the military commanders actually had rights in the territories that they liberated from the Confederacy to basically free slaves. It proclaimed the freedom of all slaves in the 10 states in rebellion that were not really under the jurisdiction of the federal government because they were part of the Confederacy. That's what the war was about. And even though it excluded areas not in rebellion, places like Delaware and Maryland, Kentucky and Missouri, it still applied to more than 3.5 million of the 4 million slaves in the country. So basically, it was a promise by Lincoln that when the war is won, the slaves will be free. So what the proclamation didn't do, it's important to mention, the proclamation didn't compensate the owners, did not outlaw slavery, did not grant citizenship to ex-slaves. They were called freemen or freedmen after this point. As before, there were always free blacks. Not all blacks were slaves. Just to remember that. So, and this was done, actually, it had to be done legally. So it had to be done by the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments to the Constitution adopted after the end of the war in 1865, 1868, and 1870. It was only the 15th Amendment of 1870 which gave former slaves, that is now called freedmen, right, the right of citizenship, that gave them the right to vote. So it was only after 1870 and the election of Ulysses S. Grant that you have the first black congressmen and senators. Anyways, so it was a very long and complicated process. Just have in mind that these 13, 14, and 15 amendments were actually the legal putting the language. What they did was to put the language of the Emancipation Proclamation through the legal system. That is how our system in the Republic works. The president can order things, but those orders have limits. Although now in the time of quarantine, it seems that the executive power has no limits. But there is a limit. Those orders can be challenged in court, and the law applies. And the law was in the United States in favor of slavery, and it was only through the amendments that the slaves were given rights and finally recognized as full American citizens by the 15th Amendment. So it happened in these three sections. But this is the job for the whoever teaches you U.S. History 2 in the next semester. This process is called the Reconstruction, and it happened after the Civil War. So I just want to mention these are three amendments because they're really important. They are the ones that actually made former slaves into citizens. Anyways, that was slide number 29. I'm looking at one of the consequences of the slide 30, one of the consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation, and that is what is called here the United States Colored Troops. There were many of these after the Emancipation Proclamation. There were a lot of black people, freemen, in the North. There were black regiments. Even in Lincoln's army, the regiments were largely segregated. Although very often there were black soldiers who served with the white. But anyways, the legacy of slavery is harsh, and getting rid of it was a long process. So anyways, United States colored troops, we have here a lot of them joined and fought. To a great surprise of the Southern Democrats. Anyways, here we have on the slide number 31, one of these people. I just wanted to pull him out so you get a feeling of, what a pardon me, allergies, hopefully, right? William Harvey Kearny, who was born as a slave in Norfolk, Virginia in 1840. He escaped to Underground Railroad and joined his father in Massachusetts. Kearny actually joined the famous 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment in March of 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation, and he took part in the July 18th assault on the Fort Wagner in Charleston. That's one of these forts that we were talking about in Charleston that the Union Navy was basically trying to take back from the Confederates. And he was the first black person to earn a Medal of Honor. Even though he was not awarded, actually he was awarded, listen carefully what it says here, his actions there ultimately earned him the Medal of Honor. So even though he was a free man, he was legally, because of the Dred Scott decision. If you remember that decision, so Mr. Carney was legally not a citizen of the United States, and therefore he could not get the Medal of Honor. It was only through the 15th Amendment that black people became citizens of the United States, and therefore they could get a Medal of Honor, and it was given to him. I forgot now. It's like 20 years after the event or so. So it took a while for this to happen. So, anyways, this much about the Eastern Theater, right? That's what it is called, the Eastern Theater. This stretch of land from Washington D.C. to Virginia, where there are a lot of battles but very little movement, and where ultimately, actually, what happened was that Abraham Lincoln finally decided to remove George McClellan from the command of the Army of the Potomac and put a successful person in charge, and that successful person, we're going to now talk about him right now. So the other front was the Western Front, and that started at the Ohio River and then into Kentucky. Even though Kentucky was kind of here and there, he was, formally speaking, he was part of the Union. Kentucky, the state of Kentucky, was part of the Union, but it had a lot of Southern sympathizers. So anyways, this Western Front was commanded by General Ulysses S. Grant. And I mentioned before, he was extremely successful. He made a two-pronged attack. One was to capture this port on the confluence of the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers into the Ohio River. And anyways, I don't think it's the confluence with the Ohio River. It's just the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River come together there. That's really on the border between Tennessee and Kentucky. I'm looking at the map here. So, two important sieges over there, which Grant won and earned his reputation of being just the best dog in the fight. Just he was relentless. Criticized for the high amount of casualties, but I don't think that's the fault of Ulysses Grant. It was the fault of the new kind of war that was being fought. Modern war is an industrial war with new technology, with machine guns, with artillery, with very efficient rifles. And war in the industrial age is more efficient as everything else. It kills more people. In a way, it was a prefiguration of the globally speaking, the first modern war is industrial war. It was World War One, but this was in many ways more like World War One than it was like, I don't know, the Mexican-American War or the colonial wars. So, anyways, substantially more casualties. But Ulysses and Grant pushed south through Tennessee, getting into Nashville, going all the way down to Tennessee River to Shiloh, where he actually fought a difficult battle. And then I talked about the two-pronged approach. Went down the Mississippi River Delta all the way to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and that was one branch of his army. The other branch, under the command of Sherman, and then Grant followed there too, went from Nashville to Chattanooga, and there was a major battle there at Chattanooga, and then from Chattanooga into Atlanta and all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. That's called Sherman's March to the Sea. So we have here on slide 33 Ulysses S. Grant, who after initial success in the Western theater of the war was appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac and replaced George McClellan, who then, out of resentment, actually decided to run against Lincoln in the elections of 1865. But for now, we have Ulysses S. Grant here, who was raised in Ohio. He was admitted to West Point Academy and graduated at the bottom of his class. He wasn't really an excellent student. In 1848, he married Julia Dent, and they had 4 children. And Grant resigned his commission in 1854, returned to family life, but lived in poverty for 7 years. And during the Civil War, he led the campaign which gained control of the Mississippi River in 1863. And for 13 months afterwards, Grant fought Robert E. Lee. And finally, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And a week later, after that surrender of Lee, God forbid Grant never surrendered. He was famous for it. So, anyways, a week later, after the Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Lincoln was assassinated in Washington, D.C. Anyways, after the assassination, actually, Grant openly broke with the vice president, who was a Democrat, and who ran with Lincoln as a pro-union Democrat. But once he became president, he was really obsessed with compromise. With the compromise. So basically, Vice President Johnson's attitude was, well, there was a war. No, forget about slavery and all this stuff. Let's get back to where things were before the war, which was impossible at this point. Too many people died for that to happen. Anyways, on slide 34, we have Grant, who's buried in Grant's tomb. I don't know. There is this question: who's buried in Grant's tomb? Well, Ulysses says Grant. It's the tomb is located on the Riverside Drive, near Columbia University. I think it's around 118th Street, somewhere thereabout. In the park overlooking the Hudson River, together with his wife. There is Ulysses Grant in Grant's tomb. Wonderful park, wonderful place to go, wonderful place to visit. Somebody who actually won the Civil War for the Union and was a great emancipator of slaves. We often call Lincoln a great emancipator, but the one who did the job, legally speaking, was Ulysses Grant. Anyways, that's about Ulysses Grant. So we have here, a couple of, what do I have here? Yes, after the Battle of Chattanooga, we have a great victory of Grant, which opened, actually, Chattanooga is on the pass of the Tennessee River that goes through the Appalachian Mountains. So when you pass through this gorge, you're getting open access to the whole of Georgia and South Carolina, all the way to the sea. So this victory at Chattanooga opened the way for Grant and his assistant lieutenant William Tecumseh Sherman to finally crash the Confederacy and get all the way to Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, all the way to the sea. I mentioned this Battle of Chattanooga because Grant was the first general after George Washington who was then given the title of Lieutenant General. it was considered such a huge success that this was the battle that sort of broke the Confederacy's back. We have a couple of pictures here on 36 of William Tecumseh Sherman. Interesting character from Ohio, and a couple of his pictures as he was about to enter the city of Atlanta. The siege of Atlanta was portrayed in the movie Gone with the Wind. I don't know, it's an old movie now, very old, made in the 30s. And it's a bit of a garbage movie in my opinion, but it was extremely popular always. It takes the side of the Confederacy and romanticizes the Confederacy, and Vivian Lee's in there. And Claire Gable, a good old movie, but completely historically inaccurate. But it was written by the novel that was, after which the movie was made, was written by a Southern lady who was a sympathizer of the Confederacy. So it was the part of this Confederate nostalgia, which I don't know. I have trouble understanding, but it's present. And that's why there, close to Chattanooga in Georgia, there is a stone mountain where you have what is called, here is a picture on the slide 37, the so-called Confederate Mount Rushmore, when they started carving out the statues of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and General Stonewall Jackson. And I don't know, Southerners still go there and supposedly admire their heritage. Anyways, slide 38 is the man who burned Atlanta and therefore got bad reputation to the movie Gone with the Wind, Mr. Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman. And we have a picture here of his monument on the Fifth Avenue, the corner of Central Park and Fifth Avenue. One of the person most responsible for the victory of the Union. Person who really broke the spine of the Union, divided into two pieces, and made it possible for Grant to then squeeze Virginia and forced Lee to surrender. Anyways, we have slide 1939 and the elections of 1865, where George McClellan, a Democrat and a former general. This was such a scandal because Lincoln thought that McClellan was not fighting full-heartedly for the Union, that he was sabotaging the war effort. And really, these elections are extremely important because if George McClellan had won, he ran on the peace platform. And here you have a picture of, they were in the tent here, I think this is at the Battle of Antietam. But here's two of them together, Lincoln on the left and McClellan on the right. There, McClellan hated Lincoln. Lincoln kind of just thought that McClellan was ineffective and slow. So anyways, slide 4 tells us about this peace platform of the Democratic Party. McClellan was nominated by the Democrats to run against Abraham Lincoln in 1864, in the elections of 1864. I have a typo here, let me correct that so you get the right thing. He did not resign his commission until election day, November the 8th of 1864. McClellan was wishy-washy about his goal with regard to the war, but the Democratic Party called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the negotiated settlement with the Confederacy basically getting back, pardon me, getting back to the situation before the war, which was impossible, obviously, because if they could have come to an agreement, they wouldn't have started the war. So this was a bit of an embarrassment for McClellan. He tried to be wishy-washy about it, but it didn't really work. Election won the election handily with 212 electoral college votes to 21 for McClellan. The popular vote was closer, 55 to 45%. But what was especially embarrassing for McClellan was the military vote went nearly 3-1 in favor of Lincoln. And Lincoln's share in the vote of the Army of the Potomac was 70%, which tells you about how effective McClellan was as a general. He was probably less effective than the presidential candidate. And we have slide number 41 here. McClellan, the Democratic candidate, who's trying to stop Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, the Republican and the Democrat, from tearing up the Union. McClellan was one of those people who claimed, "Oh, we're all to blame for this," and but I don't know. I personally don't like that sort of attitude because somebody famous said that those who blame everybody blame nobody. But anyways, paraphrasing a little bit, there is another saying about this. But anyways, McClellan, Democratic candidate, lost in 1864, and Lincoln was re-elected for the second term. He went to a theater after inauguration of April 14th, the Ford Theater. Here is a picture of the Ford Theater on the slide number 42. In 1865, where he was assassinated. A former actor, Mr. Booth, was the assassin, but there was a whole conspiracy. This was not the first time that assassination was attempted. Lincoln was living for 4 years in a pit full of snakes, Washington, D.C. And it was the snake pit was fuller than usual. Washington D.C. and it's really a small stretch of territory between Maryland and Virginia, and it was full of Democrats and full of sympathizers of the Confederacy. So it's really a miracle that he survived that long over there. But after the surrender of General Lee, Lincoln was assassinated. It was a huge conspiracy. That's we often focus on the assassin, but assassin was a part of a great conspiracy. Conspirators were caught after a chase of a couple of days, and they were caught in the neighborhood in Virginia and in Maryland, and it was obvious that they had systematic support. The hotel where they stayed, where they rented horses, changed horses, the surgeons that operated on Booth, who was wounded, and things of that sort. So a lot of people are arrested as part of the conspiracy. And you have the execution of the guilty ones there on slide 42, including the first woman. I forgot her name, last name Mary. Her first name was Mary, but the first woman ever executed in the United States, considered to be a part of the conspiracy. And then came Mr. Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, Democrat, who let me just read what I have for you. Andrew Johnson, I'm sorry, did I say Jackson? Andrew Johnson, right? Andrew Johnson, not Andrew Jackson. That's something else. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat who ran with Lincoln on the National Union ticket. Lincoln did this to balance the ticket because he wanted some of the Democrats in the North to support the Union, and that's why he picked Andrew Johnson as a pro-Union Democrat. But Johnson favored a quick restoration of the seceded states, and basically it's the same attitude that McClellan had. Let's forget about what happened. It was all a big misunderstanding. Let's forget about the protection for the former slaves because that annoys the Southern Democrats, and it just leads to a political conflict. And this led to his conflict with the Republican-dominated Congress, culminating in his impeachment. And I believe he was impeached several times, not just once, by the House of Representatives in 1861. He was acquitted in the Senate, and this is the closest we ever got to the removal of president by the legislature. Only one vote in favor of Johnson saved Johnson from being removed from office. He alienated almost everybody. Democrats for being not enough pro-slavery and Republicans for being pro-slavery. And he just didn't have a future. It was especially hard to former slaves to live through the three or something years of the administration of Andrew Johnson, because they were in this legal limbo, that they were freed, but they were not given civil rights, so nobody knew what their legal status was, which was finally resolved by the 15th Amendment and by the election of Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was elected in 1868. He was a war hero and a reluctant politician, unanimously nominated by the Republican Party, and was elected president in 1868. As president, Grant stabilized the post-war economy, created the Department of Justice, and was very famous for prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was organization of Southern Confederate veterans. It was started in Pulaski, Tennessee, and including a lot of famous generals including General Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, which famously appears in the movie Forrest Gump. I don't know, I find it always fascinating, but that's how Forrest Gump got his name. The Klan was the organization of the Southern Democrats, whose purpose was to prevent the black people from being elected to office. Namely, Confederacy was an occupied territory, and it was run by military governors. And those military governors had instructions from Lincoln to allow black participation in political life. And Ku Klux Klan was there to prevent that and to make sure that the Democratic Party continues to dominate the South. So the first black people who were elected to Congress, and could only happen after the 15th Amendment was passed, were actually, without exception, Republicans, which annoyed the Southern Democrats even more, and that's why afterwards, after the Civil War, they try all these things to prevent the black people from voting. So, because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments allowed black people to vote, they added additional local ordinances that prevented actual registration of black people into the election rolls. So, such as literacy tests and things of that sort. And those laws generally are called the Jim Crow laws, and they were introduced by the Southern Democrats who fought in the Confederacy and then wanted to prevent the black people to be political allies with their opponents, Republicans. So anyways, here we have the last slide here, slide 45. The first American in Congress, Hiram Rhodes Revels, who was born free in North Carolina. He later lived and worked in Ohio, where he voted before the Civil War. He became the first African American to serve in the U.S. Congress when he was elected to the United States Senate as a Republican to represent the state of Mississippi in 1870 and 1871 during what is called the Reconstruction era. So that's about it. Anyways, that brings us to the end of our lectures here. The course doesn't end here, but my lectures are over. I will not torture any further with this, but some other course maybe. But this one, we finished the Civil War. We talked about slavery, Emancipation Proclamation, Black Republicans, Ku Klux Klan, Sherman, Grant, and other things. A lot of monuments around New York City dedicated to the Union victory. Sherman's monument is on the Fifth Avenue, as I mentioned, there by Apple Store. People used to call that area after Sherman, it was a Grand Army Plaza, but now it's where the Apple Store is. In Brooklyn, the Grand Army Plaza, at the beginning of the Prospect Park, another huge, one of the most beautiful monuments to the Union armies in the country. Triumphal Arch, modeled after Paris, the one in Paris. So anyways, that much about Civil War. Exams coming up to check if you guys are listening to this, and our final, and that's it. All right, bye.